The Middle East and the Powers. Ever since the 19th century, when so-called reforms were initiated in the Ottoman Empire, there have not been wanting Western ministers and diplomats to look on Middle Eastern politics with hope and expectancy. It is quite common knowledge that in the last 100 years, the Middle East has seen no quiet, that disturbance has succeeded disturbance, and that violent, categorical men have followed each other to prescribe and apply drastic but unavailing remedies. It might therefore seem more prudent to assume that the distemper of the modern East is not a passing one, that its political instability is rather the outcome of a deep social and intellectual crisis which the schemes of the reformer and the goodwill of the philanthropist can scarcely assuage or modify. And yet the sober assumption that Middle Eastern instability is today endemic has found little favour either in Britain or in America. The prevalent fashion has been to proclaim the latest revolution as the herald of a new day, and the newest turbulence as the necessary and beneficent prelude to an epoch of orderliness and justice. The meliorism of Western liberals, the activist categories, and the hopeful concepts of their political science go far to explain such an attitude, as also their conviction that a stable, universal peace will ensue only when the world is composed of democratic and progressive nation-states. Whatever the truth of this dogma, it is not one which the statesman should entertain, and indeed it is irrelevant to him whether the events with which he has to cope are milestones on a road leading somewhere, or mere variations on an eternal theme eternally repeated. The ultimate significance of social and political change and the remote consequences of action are dim and uncertain. The power of chance, the accident of personality, the ritual of tradition, and the passions of men are always at work to mock benevolence and denature its contrivances. It is enough for practical men to fend off present evils and secure existing interests. They must not cumber themselves with historical dogmas or chase illusions in that maze of double talk which Western political vocabulary has extended over the whole world. But when recent British and American policies in the Middle East are considered, together with the doctrines and principles which justify them, then it is realised with a large part of verbal traps and dubious dogmas have had in the construction of doctrines and the shaping of policies. The reasons for this are many. The fact that the Middle East is remote, that its traditions and its codes of behaviour are alien, should not by itself have necessarily led to misunderstanding. The unfamiliar may invite caution as well as recklessness, but in this case, the remoteness meant that it was difficult and in many cases impracticable to judge and to criticise in the light of common sense and experience certain interpretations of Middle Eastern history and politics offered to the Americans and the British by interpreters who seemed expert and well placed. Among the most influential of these in America are the missionaries. Their case is curious. They went out to proselytize and have stayed to sympathize. To America they began, some 50 years ago, to present a picture of Islam as a strict Unitarian version of Protestantism, democratic and egalitarian. The task before Christians, they said, was not to make converts from Islam to Christianity, it was rather to lean over Middle Eastern society with compassion, to take it by the hand, rescue it from centuries of superstition, corruption, and tyranny. Essentially and basically, Islam was enlightened and progressive. The Western education which they, the missionaries, provided would serve to make Muslims aware of the true value of their religion, and to inculcate in them a sense of brotherhood towards Christians who, after all, worship, albeit in their own manner, the same true God as the Muslims, and in fact, it is asserted this is what is more and more happening in the Middle East. Enlightenment is spreading, the rulers are acquiring a public conscience, and democracy becomes stronger every day. To take a recent instance of the attitudes of these missionaries, the time seems ripe, writes the Reverend Eric W. Bethman, director of the Department of Research and Publications of the American Friends of the Middle East, to usher in the era of cooperation, a cooperation based on mutual respect for and esteem of the deep spiritual qualities inherent in both religions. These qualities are part of every believing Muslim and every believing Christian, finding in each their deepest realization in prayer, and where prayer, love, and mercy dwell, there God is dwelling too. Such an interpretation of the Middle Eastern situation is difficult to dislodge, not only because its sponsors are authoritative and well placed. Two other factors at least allow such interpretation to go unchallenged. The first, as has been said, is that of remoteness. One of the simplest and yet most effective means known to mankind of keeping touch with reality is to contrast what people say with what they do, to compare professions with performance, in one's own society with a clear conception of one's position and interests, with a familiar knowledge of the meaning of words and the significance of behaviour. A test such as this seldom fails, but a power such as America is unlikely to have a clear and unsettled conception of its interest in every distant part of the world, where events compel her to have a policy. Alien conventions and unfamiliar speech add to the confusion. Reports are uncertain, actions dissolve in a haze, causes and consequences are alike shadowy and unsubstantial, and those in power seem more the emanations of current legend and fashionable doctrine than solid men of flesh and blood, who take bribes and make conspiracies, who deport, imprison, and kill. All too often, therefore, assumptions are not tested on the pulse of experience, they remain mere abstract doctrines, and men are taken up and praised for what they say rather than what they are. This tendency is reinforced by a second powerful factor. The language of modern English and American politics is now so adopted by the whole world and divorced from the tradition in which it has value and dignity, becomes a debased, inflated jargon, a showman's patter by which tyranny is made to seem constitutional and crookedness to seem to look straight. The snare of this familiarity, more than any exotic remoteness, entraps the mind with smooth explanations and plausible theories. Therefore, we read of our condition in Holy Scripture, is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. The missionary arguments have their equivalents in Britain. They are not identical, but they tend to the same conclusions. Influential Orientalists and commentators on Oriental affairs have been successful in spreading a deep sense of guilt among the English intellectual and political classes. The West, they have argued, has sinned grievously. It has sinned from ignorance and presumption, and it has sinned from cupidity. It has been contemptuousness of Eastern values, and it has taken advantage of Eastern weakness to impose its domination. In its pure condition, the academics have said, Islam is more wholesome than Western civilization. It forbids drunkenness, prohibits usury, and makes very difficult the war of the classes. And what has Britain done? It has let vice loose in the East. It has made cupidity attractive and has shattered the harmony of the classes. These assertions contain sufficient truth to make them plausible, but the passion and the tenacity with which they have been held and advanced vindicate neither the judgment nor the discretion of their authors, for they have not been content merely to expound a theory of nature and the history of Islam. They have condemned, rebuked, and recommended. They have said that the action of France and Britain after the First World War twisted and deformed the political development of the Arab countries. There were then upright, moderate Arab nationalists who were prepared to cooperate with the West and to set up modern, enlightened, and progressive policies. They were thwarted, betrayed, and driven to violence and extreme courses. Britain conspired with France and the Zionists to deny the Arabs their just claims and to bring ruin on them. The least that the West could do now was to make amends for their sins, to repair the moral and material damage it had sinfully wrought. It had to promote and guarantee Arab unity, to provide political support for Arab nationalism, and to give ample, unconditional economic aid. This, of course, is now a familiar weapon of Arab propaganda, but the weapon was forged and perfected by English writers and scholars. Their work was made easier by two circumstances. The first lay in the nature of the Anglo-American historiography, dealing with recent political events. Some of the most influential versions of the origins and consequences of the First World War were based on the assumption of, or rather the conviction, that the war and the unsatisfactory settlement which followed it were both due to the operations of powerful and sinister interests trying to realise their aims by secret diplomacy. Had diplomacy been open, it was argued, many disastrous consequences would have been averted, and governments would not have dared to avow, much less try to secure, their illicit and dangerous ambitions. Now it was, of course, the case that the Allies had concerted the settlement of the Eastern question by means of secret agreements, and this was not enough to denounce the settlement, which was not particularly concerned with pan-Arab ambitions, as immoral, dishonourable, and worthless. This explains, for instance, the extraordinary currency which even today George Antonius's Tendentious History still enjoys as an authority on the transactions of the allies of the Arabs and the Zionists. The other circumstance which has confirmed the current picture of the modern Middle Eastern history, as it obtains in Britain, is the outcome of an accident, the consequences of which are prodigious and inexhaustible. This accident is the involvement of Lawrence and his friends in the British Middle Eastern policy. Lawrence was an outsider who suddenly rose to fame and power in the space of a very few years. He had neither the esprit de corps nor the understanding of the state's position and interest which comes from the constant and regular practice of government and diplomatic negotiation. His impassioned apologetic was therefore violently eccentric and out of all relation to the facts. This in itself is not surprising. What is surprising is that powerful and influential men, neither outsiders nor eccentrics, accepted and embraced the version of history so subversive of their country's position and so contemptuous of traditional instruments of its welfare, such as the army and the civil service. The burden of Lawrence's complaint and the refrain of his party was that a great act of injustice had been committed against the Arabs by reactionary politicians and their ridiculous civil servants. This has happened because these men were ignorant of the new forces in the East, and because of their criminal weakness in the face of the satanic designs of France. Lawrence and his friends spoke not as mere students of politics, but with authority. They had been there, in this new East, they were acquainted with the new men, and they had recommended them heartily to the British public, and this again is a matter for surprise. What surprises is not so much Lawrence's own extravagance as that of his friends, who took up and sponsored little conspiratorial offices devoid of political style and filled with tedious political fanaticisms. The result of all this has been to establish as a commonplace of political discussion that the two most important issues confronting statesmen in the Middle East are Zionism and imperialism. It is asserted that these two factors are at the root of instability in the area. If these two factors could somehow be removed, or if the Arabs could be convinced that they had been removed, or at least neutralised, then there would be a hopeful prospect of peace and prosperity. How sound is such an analysis? Two questions arise at once. Are these, in the first place, issues capable of settlement, and in the second, even if they were settled, would peace and progress establish their dominion in the Middle East? What may one properly mean by settlement of the Palestine problem? Because of the shape and history of the dispute, one cannot mean a settlement of the dispute which arose between the Palestinians, Zionist and Arab. This dispute has become secondary and indeed forgotten. The dispute now lies between Israel and the Arab states, but to put the matter in this way is to confuse the accidental with the essential, for in this wider dispute, Israel is the immediate but not the most important factor. This lies in the rivalries of the Arab states which led them to form an Arab League, in which each party tried to gain the ascendancy. Of this game, Palestinian Arabs, together with the Oriental Jewries, were the hapless victims. A solution of the Palestine problem, we may therefore say, will accomplish little even if all the Israelis were exterminated and their state destroyed. For then would perhaps come a quarrel about the spoils and the issues even more intractable, but certainly not peace. Imperialism as an issue of practical politics is even more deceptive and irrelevant, for what can it mean to say that imperialism has to be eliminated before peace can be assured in the Middle East? For some time now, it has meant that what remains of British and French influence in the Middle East has to be destroyed. This obviously does not entail the elimination of the influence of other great powers. On the contrary, but to replace British and French influence and rivalries by American and Soviet ones is not necessarily to secure greater prosperity or a firmer peace. If, however, the contention means that peace cannot be secured in the area until all great powers cease to have influence in the Middle East, then it is a nonsensical one that the outcome of fashionable Western sentimentality, which holds that great powers are nasty and small powers virtuous. Further, since great powers necessarily must always wield influence in this area, the contention becomes an empty slogan further to confuse and debase the language of political discourse. The elimination of British and French power and influence in the Middle East may, of course, have been thought to redound to the benefit of the United States. An indulgence in current political jargon, it may be argued, was a convenient smokescreen to better reach this objective. If the use of jargon implies no doctrinal commitment, then we may inquire whether the elimination of British and French influence had to remain a permanent aim of United States policy, and how far the acceptance and further propagation of such a jargon could help to establish the influence of the United States in the area. The elimination of Britain and France, however, has strengthened not only merely the United States but also the Soviet Union. This is not only the unwitting result of a particular policy, as was the case with American action at the time of the Suez expedition, but it is inherent in the very logic of the situation. Short of enforcing her claim by war, the United States cannot be the only patron in the area. And with Britain and France eliminated, some clients, at least in the hope of satisfying their local ambitions, will find attractive the patronage of the only other great power remaining, namely the Soviet Union. Such a situation, as Britain eventually found to her cost, provides a temptation which is difficult to resist, and which may lead to a great loss. The fortuitous and temporary absence of Russia from the Middle East after 1917 meant that Britain and France remained there face to face, and the traditional triangular or quadrilateral game of the Eastern Question, as it was perfected in the 19th century, could no longer be played. Anti-French prejudices, which coloured so much of British political attitudes between the wars, made it seem, therefore, safe, reasonable, and attractive to edge out the French out of the Levant, so that Britain would remain the sole dominant power. In the event, this led to the undoing not only of the French position, but of the British as well. The very same arguments that were used, with British encouragement and applause, against the French were later turned against Britain with equal effect. History, it is true, neither teaches lessons nor repeats itself, and where Britain failed, the United States may well succeed. However, if the United States and the Soviet Union are the only patrons, they are likely both to be forced into the same posture. They must try to outbid one another, but with the Soviet Union as competitor, it does not seem profitable for the United States to ride, out of conviction or convenience, the anti-imperialist wave. Neither has the Soviet Union found much profit in becoming the patron of pan-Arabism. Britain tried to do it and promoted the Arab League, but like the old man of the sea, the extravagant rhetoric and inflated ambitions conjured up on that occasion remained inexorably to cramp and cripple all attempts to follow a saner policy. Anti-imperialism in the Middle East as an issue of practical politics is either irrelevant or nonsensical. It increases misunderstandings and promotes illusions, to the benefit of agitators and those who know how, and do not scruple to use them. In such a game, the losers are the peaceable and the civilized. Tidy doctrines, then, will not help, and simple answers will deceive. The disorder of the East is deep and endemic, and the disappearance neither of Israel nor of the so-called imperialism will cure or even mitigate it. The very attempts to modernize Middle Eastern society, to make it Western or democratic, must bring about evils, which may be greater than the benefits. Today, it is fashionable to say that the prosperity coming to certain countries in the Middle East from oil, from foreign aid, and from increased economic activity will in the end mean the development of that middle class hitherto so notoriously absent from Muslim history, which will prove a bulwark of constitutionality and freedom. This hope is presumably based on an analogy with European and American history, an analogy which is, however, quite false. The middle classes in Europe and America attain their greatness by their own efforts, without the help of government, as in America, sometimes against the obstruction of aristocrats and absolutists, as in Europe. But whereas economic enterprise was in the West predominantly the affair of individuals, in the Middle East it is predominantly the affair of governments. The British government neither opened up the coal mines of the British Isles, nor claimed to share the profits of the enterprise with the mine owners. Similarly, the government of the United States did not claim that every Texan who found oil in his backyard should give up half the value of his property to the state. It may be argued that this has caused great discrepancies in wealth, and that the benefits of wealth are distributed at random, in proportion neither to merit nor to need. This may well be, but such a state of affairs is inseparable from the libertarianism, the independence, and the mistrust of authority, which are traditionally associated with the qualities of the middle classes in the West, and which, it is now hoped, can somehow be transplanted in the Middle East. But in this area, government is the chief entrepreneur. It is the recipient of oil royalties and foreign aid, and it is through its decisions and its favours that prosperity filters through to the generality of the people. Again, it may be argued that this arrangement is the one most conducive to the greatest welfare, but in this case, it has to be most recognised that it does not diminish, but rather magnifies and exaggerates the power of government. In Europe, the middle classes attained political power after becoming economically predominant. In the Middle East, it looks as though modern economic processes will lead to no small such result. Since these processes only accentuate what has already been a character of Muslim society, namely the dependence of all ranks and classes on the central political authority, now, as in the past, wealth generally depends on access to political power, on the benevolence or at least the acquiescence of those in power. In an area where political power is traditionally capricious in the transmission, acquired by violence and established by repression, it is the caprice of those in power rather than the impersonality of the economic process which gives society its predominant character and its characteristic visage, and what must also tend to confirm habits and an established character is that this new wealth is not the product of local enterprise, but seems a sudden, capricious windfall, the tribute which a miraculous providence has compelled the powers of Europe and America to press upon the East. Another modern development which tends in the same direction is an outcome of Westernization. European administrative techniques have been put at the disposal of the local governments, who have been thus enabled as never before to exert a minute systematic control over social and economic activities. New methods of import licensing, exchange control, and fiscal supervision have made private persons quite dependent on the goodwill of those in authority who are able, when they choose, to punish the object of their malice and ill will swiftly and effectively. It is by such means that the Iraqi government was able efficiently to spoil and loot the Jews of Iraq, and by similar means that the government of Egypt has been able recently to follow in its footsteps. This new power of government makes even more complete the dependence of the economic on the political, and must thus hinder the emergence of that independent middle class on which so much hope is set. This increase in the power of government affects not only the economic sphere, but extends in all directions. The modernisation of society in the Middle East has not been the result of private initiative and the gradual adaptation of a local tradition to changing conditions. Rather, it has been imposed from above by decree and implemented as far as possible by officials. This meant that the traditional articulation of Middle Eastern society has either to bend to the will of the reformer or be completely dislocated. Such has been the fate of Muslim as well as non-Muslim religions and communal organisations, of provincial particularisms, of local and vested interests. Individuals are now equal under the law, corporations the creatures of statute, and law and statute, the irresistible will of a central and sovereign authority. This increase and concentration in the power of government is the most striking consequence so far of the attempt to westernize Middle Eastern society. It has given new life to the political attitudes prevalent in Muslim society. It has confirmed the subject in his passive obedience to the effective ruler, and the ruler for the time being in the amplitude of his power. Political stability in such a situation is, of necessity, chancy, and precarious. The traditional checks and balances have grown progressively weaker, habits of liberty are unknown, and the subject has more reason than ever to fear the displeasure of his masters. To get hold of power, it is sufficient to get hold of the central mechanism, and the rewards of power are prodigious. This instability is increased by the character of the men who now compete for power. They are new men whose earliest and deepest political impulse is contempt for the ways of their fathers. Youth, which in most countries and ages has been a disqualification for the practice of government, has become, since the days of the Young Turks, an advantage in the contest for power. The dislocation of society is made more acute by estrangement between the generations. The younger are those who possess the techniques of Europe, which Middle Eastern society, so they insist, must adopt or perish. Therefore, they know better than their fathers, and they have the key to political salvation. The passion and presumption of youth, the rooted belief in their ancestors' ignorance and folly, their inexperience and clumsiness in the exercise of power, combine to deprive them of that decorum and gravitas which impressed foreign observers in the Muslim ruling classes of past centuries, and which served to put a decent check on the full expression of greed and cruelty. Heaven knows that sedition, treason, and civil war are common enough in Middle Eastern history, but only in the present age is revolution glorified as a necessary part of the political process. Violence proclaimed beneficent and treason holy. The institutions and the men who control them combine together to make these unfortunate Middle Eastern polities the victims of instability and the sports of civil commotion. This has been the case ever since the Young Turks came to power, and there is no sign of change. If only because of these factors, it would be prudent to expect trouble and not to put too much faith in simple solutions and neat explanations. But there are also other reasons which concern more intimately the conduct of foreign policy. The Muslim theory of international relations recognises two possible situations only: war on the infidel or a subjugation to the faithful. Peace with him de jure is impossible. There can only be various grades of active or passive hostility until he recognises the authority of the Muslim ruler. Such indeed has been not only the theory but the practice in the relations of Muslim and Christian powers. The disturbed frontiers between Israel and her neighbours today are nothing exceptional. They exemplify rather what has normally been the case on the frontier between Christendom and Islam. The concepts, therefore, of international law and practice which had been current for centuries in the Christian West, concepts such as the concert of the powers, the Committee of Nations, or the sanctity of treaties, the rules of natural justice or decent respect for the opinions of mankind, are quite alien and largely unintelligible to the Middle East. It is significant that the Ottoman Empire was formally made a member of the Concert of Europe only after the Crimean War, when it had lost its superiority and was being gradually overwhelmed by the Christian powers. It is not surprising, then, that to Muslim minds the Western vocabulary of international relations should appear little relevant to the most important preoccupation, namely the steady encroachment by Christian powers over the domain of Islam. The same may be said of the Muslims' attitude to the two creations of the Western theory of international relations, the League of Nations and the United Nations, for by the time these institutions came to be set up, the Christian powers seemed more powerful and dominating than ever. The Muslim states thought of themselves not as mere quiescent members of the Committee of Nations, but as fighters engaged in an active struggle against the very powers who claimed to set the tone and establish the rules of behaviour in international relations. Their adherence to the Western principles of international relations is as formal as the admittance of the Ottoman Empire to the Concert of Europe in 1856. These traditional Muslim attitudes have been confirmed and fortified by nationalist doctrine, which of all Western political doctrines has been the most popular and best understood in the Middle East. The international theory of nationalism is as little disposed as the Muslim theory to envisage a stable international order as a practical possibility. The Muslim theory postpones this to the day when the last infidel shall have made his obeisance to the Caliph, while nationalist theory postpones it to the day when national vindication shall have been all satisfied. Both are subversive of international stability, both are activist, both consider conflict not a regrettable evil, not even the continuation of diplomacy by other means, but so long as a single imperfection subsists in the world, or so long as a single principle remains unrealized, a duty the discharge of which is exhilarating and rewarding. Against all this turbulence, a simple strategy does not avail. Resource, cunning, patience, and steadfastness can be scarce contend with it, but even they will fail once it is fought. They can do no more than keep their disorder at bay.